Hey guys! Tonight we begin in the dim stone corridors of a 13th century convent, where by candlelight and quiet devotion, a group of medieval nuns are preparing what may well be the most spiritually charged cucumber you've never considered. You probably think of nuns and picture chanting, maybe a lot of bread baking and long silences. But here's a twist in more than one abbey across Europe. Preserved vegetables, especially pickles, were practically sacred. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your city and current local time in the comments? I always love seeing where and when people are drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the abbess's pantry. It smells faintly of dried lavender beeswax and something sharp vinegar perhaps, or aged garlic. The shelves are crammed with ceramic crocks and glass jars, each with a handwritten tag. One says, "The Blessed Beets," another cucumber Sister Adela's second batch, 1286. The light from a nearby candle flickers against the glint of brine. You weren't expecting this much cucumber-based reverence, were you? It turns out pickling was more than a hobby. For these nuns, it was preservation, both physical and spiritual. In a world without refrigeration, turning a fresh vegetable into something shelf-stable was nothing short of miraculous. And since miracles were kind of the nuns' thing, they embraced the art of fermentation with quiet fervor. Mainstream historians agree that convents were major centers of agricultural and culinary innovation. While monks had their brewing traditions, nuns often became stewards of kitchen gardens, medicine, and yes, pickles. It wasn't just about storage, it was also about care, time, prayer, patience, and probably a little competitive pride. Because let's be honest, if you just spent 6 hours in silence, weaving cassava fiber into a chapel curtain, wouldn't you want your dill spears to outshine the prioress's carrot ribbons? One particular abbey in what's now northern France became known not officially, of course, for its unusually elaborate pickling techniques. The sisters there experimented with everything: rosewater vinegar, fermented garlic leaves, even early chili seeds brought by traveling merchants. One nun, Sister Marielle, had such a talent for layering pickled red cabbage and leeks that nobles started sending politely worded requests for her methods. She never responded. The recipes were a cloistered secret. Now here's the quirky twist. Sister Marielle also believed her pickles could ward off demons of temptation. She allegedly slept with a jar of brined radishes by her bed, wrapped in a linen pouch stitched with psalms. One chronicler notes that she once fasted from speech for a week after dropping a batch and considered it a test of divine patience. Her roommate probably considered it divine relief. Historians still argue whether these devotional pickling habits were part of formal religious rituals or simply a case of spiritualized housework. After all, much of a nun's day revolved around repetition rhythm and routine. If peeling onions became prayer and salting cucumbers meant meditating on impermanence, well, it kind of worked. And the abbess, her pantry was her pride. There's a surviving inventory list from the 1290s that mentions 12 crops of preserved cucumis, which could mean cucumbers or melons, or any vaguely gourd-shaped vegetable. Medieval Latin wasn't always precise. Either way, She kept them sealed under wax labeled in ink and stored on elevated wooden slats far from the damp. At midnight prayers, it said she would often bring a few jars to the altar, not for offering, but to gently rotate them, inspect the seals, and maybe, just maybe, let a younger sister sniff the brine to feel the Lord's clarity through pungency. You sit now, cross-legged on the cool flagstone floor, watching as a younger novice reverently dusts off a lid and scribbles something into a vinegar-stained notebook. The candle's flame dances in the glass reflection. Somewhere, a quiet giggle escapes. Sister Juliana just realized she misspelled cabbage as carbonate. She'll correct it later with berry juice and hope no one notices. And just like that, the abbey returns to stillness. You're still in the pantry, though. It's shifted a bit. Early morning now, cool air pressing through the stone window slits, and Sister Juliana has long since gone off to tend the herb beds. In her place, 2 older nuns stand elbow deep in a wooden tub of cucumbers. The silence between them isn't tense. It's the kind of practiced quiet, born of years. They don't need to speak to know who adds what. One tosses in mustard seeds, the other bay leaves. Their hands move in rhythm, like monks turning pages. You watch half hypnotized as one sister gently massages salt into the vegetables, muttering something under her breath that might be a psalm or might be her grocery list. It's hard to tell. Pickling, it turns out, wasn't just for flavor or storage. It was part of a bigger, quieter mission. A way to turn ordinary food into long-lasting sustenance. You're witnessing preservation as a devotional act, pickling for the Lord. Mainstream records show that by the mid-13th century, many convents kept seasonal preservation schedules. In the early summer months, when gardens exploded with excess cucumbers, onions, carrots, and beans, the sisters moved into what some called the brining weeks. This was considered sacred work, despite, or maybe because of the smells and the vinegar fumes. Let's just say they cleared the sinuses and the soul. More than one abbey chronicler refers to this practice with near poetic reverence. One English scribe described his sister house as a haven of pickled plenty, where even the vinegar sings with grace. It's hard to tell if he was being earnest or just trying to avoid talking about the rat problem. The quirkiest part. These pickling sessions sometimes included song, soft humming, or gentle refrains of adapted chants. One Flemish order reportedly rewrote parts of the Psalter to include vegetable metaphors. Psalm 42 became "As the beat panteth after the cool root cellar, so panteth my soul after thee, O brine." Historians still debate whether this musical adaptation was widely accepted or just a particularly enthusiastic abbess expressing her creativity. But manuscript margins from the period do contain curious doodles, cucumber vines curling around Latin verses, or pickle jars with little halos above them. One shows a crucifix nestled between 2 radishes. You settle in now, cross-legged near the threshold of the pickling room. A breeze carries the faint scent of dill lavender and sharp wine vinegar. It's oddly pleasant, like standing in the middle of a dream about salad. A young novice brings a jug of spring water and pours it carefully into a jar nearly your height. The sisters nod in approval. That water came from the old well near the beehives, believed to be blessed by proximity, since the bees pollinated the herbs grown by the shrine. And don't worry, Every jar is labeled with exquisite precision. Each one bears a little wax-stamped emblem to indicate origin. South Garden, North Wall. Batch Agatha's mix, do not touch. Decorative seals were a way to ensure no one got credit for someone else's work. Medieval sisterhood was collaborative, yes, but also very petty about seasoning. The abbess strolls in robes, rustling like parchment, and inspects the progress. She says nothing but lifts one jar lid, sniffs, and raises an eyebrow high praise. The nuns smile relieved. If she'd wrinkled her nose, it might have meant a week of extra psalm recitation, and perhaps a mild talking to from Sister Benedicta, the appointed pickle overseer. Yes, that was an actual position, in some orders usually given to the nun with the most refined nose. A final quirky fact before you drift deeper into the dream. In certain convents, it was believed that the act of pickling could mirror the soul's preservation. Just as the cucumber transforms in brine, so does the soul steep in patience, humility, and divine flavor. A bit cheesy, maybe, but cheese was also brined, so it still fits. You lean against a barrel now, the cool wood pressing into your shoulder as the room fills with quiet laughter over a spilled handful of peppercorns. No one scolds. A moment of clumsiness becomes an excuse for joy. And just like that, another jar is sealed. The morning deepens sunlight filtering through a high window and casting golden streaks across the flagstones. You follow the sisters out of the pickling room and into what might generously be called the vinegar cellar, but in truth, it feels more like an archive of holy tang. Rows upon rows of barrels line the walls. Some are small and tightly sealed, others large enough to hide a choir boy in. The scent here is richer, deeper. You breathe in red wine, vinegar, apple must, and the faint musk of wood aged through 100 seasons above prayers and spills. This is where the vinegar chronicles live. Each barrel has a story. Carved initials, wax drips colored with berries or beetroot, and faded linen tags hint at generations of sacred experimentation. Some of the vinegar is strong enough to wake the dead, or at least make Sister Prudence sneeze for 20 seconds straight. Mainstream historical records show that medieval nuns were responsible for some of the earliest known medicinal vinegars in Europe. In addition to preservation, vinegars were believed to cure everything from melancholy to migraines. Infused with herbs like rosemary, sage, or hyssop, they became tonics, healing balms, and offerings of spiritual hygiene. One particular abbey in Burgundy had a running experiment each year. A different sister was chosen to create the vinegar of virtue. It had to be steeped for 40 days, stirred only during the Angelus bells, and kept away from anyone who had recently gossiped. That rule, according to one journal, eliminated nearly the entire abbey staff in 1347. You lean close to one glass demijohn. Its liquid a dark amber. The label reads, Quince and Rose Sister Almoda, 1263. Next to it, sage and onion, do not shake. And then most mysteriously, a dusty jar in the corner, marked only with a crescent moon and the word shh. You don't touch that one. Sister Almoda, according to convent records, was a visionary, or at least a vinegar enthusiast with ambition. She believed that quince-infused vinegar could bring clarity to the mind and soften the soul. Her recipe included quince skins, crushed white pepper, and a single peeled almond for balance. It was poured into tiny ceramic bottles, corked with beeswax and distributed only during Lent to those deemed spiritually constipated. Historians still argue whether Sister Almoda's practices were rooted in earlier Byzantine methods, or if she simply got bored one winter and had too much quince lying around. There's no scholarly consensus, but the recipe survived in 3 separate abbeys, scrawled in the margins of hymnals next to doodles of what may be dancing onions. You turn now toward the small alcove, where Sister Constance, the abbey's oldest resident, sits in a rickety chair beside a bubbling vinegar crock. She's not sleeping exactly, more like meditating. Her finger rests on the side of the barrel, occasionally tapping in rhythm to a hymn that only she seems to hear. She's been the vinegar caretaker since before anyone can remember, her secret whispering to the crocks. Not prayers, just gentle encouragement. "Don't sour too soon," she once muttered to a batch of raspberry tarragon. It won 3rd place at the regional Benedictine pantry contest, though no one speaks of that event anymore, due to a chutney-related dispute. You settle onto a bench near her, the stone cool beneath you, and let the quiet thrum of the cellar lull your thoughts. There's a myth here that the best vinegars hum at a particular pitch when they're ready. Not everyone can hear it. Only the truly patient, the genuinely devout, and the slightly hard of hearing. Sister Constance smiles without opening her eyes. That barrel, she murmurs, gesturing toward the darkest corner, sings like a tenor with a head cold. You believe her, and just like that, another vinegar is ready for bottling. You trail behind Sister Constance as she creaks her way back up the stone steps, carrying a small bottle wrapped in cloth like a sacred relic. Outside the cellar, the light seems too bright. The world smells less like vinegar and more like rosemary soil and sun-warmed laundry. In the cloister's inner courtyard, a familiar commotion hums quietly. Today is Carrot Day, or so you're told by a novice carrying a suspiciously large basket of orange roots and a look of wary determination. It's the day Sister Agatha's carrot brine gets its annual revival, and you're about to find out why it's remembered less for its taste and more for what it caused. Back in the 1300s, Sister Agatha was known as many things Sias Stern, and just a little too invested in the root vegetable family. Her pickling experiments were infamous, especially the time she fermented shredded carrots with an aggressive blend of horseradish and something she referred to as blessed ginger, which might have been powdered mustard or possibly soap. The resulting brine was sharp enough to peel paint. Mainstream sources mention this concoction only briefly, but in oral convent histories, passed down from nun to nun. Agatha's brine was legendary. It could cleanse a palate-clear sinuses, and according to one dramatic novice, make a sinner weep at 50 paces. Today, the sisters are reviving the tradition, but with a few modifications. No one wants a repeat of the Great Brine Incident of 1382, when a cork popped unexpectedly during Mass and startled 3 pigeons into dive-bombing the altar. You sit on a sun-warmed bench and watch the preparation unfold. Sisters grate carrots with methodical focus. Others fill jars with slivered garlic fennel seed and whispers of cinnamon. Every few minutes, someone pokes their head into the herb shed to ask if there's any more Agatha dust, a spice blend recreated from her notes found scribbled on the back of an illuminated calendar page between drawings of cats and what might be a radish exorcism. Historians still argue whether Sister Agatha's recipe was a serious attempt at flavor or an accidental combination of mislabeled jars. Some scholars suggest she was experimenting with humoral theory, balancing the hot and cold qualities of foods. Others think she may have had a cold and was just trying to feel something again. Either way, her carrot brine was passed down cautiously as both a recipe and a warning. The quirky part. That year after the incident, the Abbey decided to commemorate it annually with what they called the Brine Reconciliation. Nuns exchanged jars of each other's pickles as a sign of forgiveness for any petty arguments they'd had. Sister Madeline famously received 4 jars one year, none of which were sealed. You glance over at Sister Juliana, now her hand-stained orange tongue poking from the corner of her mouth, in focus, as she layers carrots cloves and a single grape for roundness. She says with the gravity of a master perfumer. Across the courtyard, a group of elder nuns is laughing softly as they retell the story of how Sister Agatha once tried to ferment parsnips with honey and accidentally created something mildly alcoholic. It was a very spiritual Lent, says one. Someone gently farts. No one flinches. It's just part of the cycle. You close your eyes, letting the moment soak in the rhythmic scrape of graters, the sun on your face, the occasional clink of a jar lid. You wonder what Sister Agatha would think of all this. Her recipe softened, tamed, made into a bonding ritual, rather than a cautionary tale. She'd probably hate it, or claim credit, hard to say. And just like that, the first jar of modern carrot brine is sealed, labeled in neat ink, and placed on the shelf beside a much older jar, with cloudy glass and a crooked wax seal. It reads Agatha, 1382, do not open. You don't. The jars are stacked now, neat little towers of orange and gold, glowing in the slanted afternoon light. You wander through the cloister garden, letting the hum of bees and far-off laughter settle into your bones. But your feet seem to take you somewhere else, past the herb beds, around the stone well, and into the quiet corridor that leads to the prayer cells. There, tucked in a corner beside a narrow wooden door, is a shelf with 3 small jars, none of them especially impressive. No decorative flourishes, no embossed wax seals, but the labels, the handwriting is flawless. The jars contain nothing more than cucumbers in brine, but the calligraphy makes them look like relics from a saint's private pantry. You've stumbled upon something far stranger than a spicy carrot experiment. You've found the theological theory of brine and virtue. It begins, oddly enough, with a nun named Sister Celsa, who believed that spiritual purification could be modeled through the art of pickling. She argued that just as the cucumber undergoes a complete transformation in the salt and vinegar, so too must the soul surrender itself to the brine of humility and discipline. She apparently did not see the humor in this analogy, but we do, quietly. Mainstream scholars of medieval monasticism acknowledge that nuns often spiritualized their labor. Gardening became prayer laundry, became reflection, but Celsa took things further. She developed a whole routine, praying over the cucumbers as she sliced them, blessing the salt by reciting the Beatitudes, even timing the boiling of vinegar to the length of certain psalms. Her fellow sisters initially humored her, assuming it was a phase. But when she began assigning penance, not through Hail Marys, but through pickle duty, 5 cucumbers for envy, 10 for vanity, they started to take notice. And perhaps the strangest part, some found it helpful. There's a surviving letter from a sister at a nearby abbey who wrote after 3 weeks of carrot-chopping silence and reflection, I feel less inclined to judge Sister Benedicta's singing voice, which still resembles a frightened goat. Celsa's philosophy, if you can call it that, spread modestly through certain nunneries, especially those lacking access to confessors. Her practice gave structure, offered metaphor, and most importantly, something to do with the abundance of cucumbers in July. The quirky tidbit, Celsa once created a sin jar, where particularly unruly sisters had to write down their misdeeds and place them into a crock of salted turnips. At the end of Lent, the turnips were burned ceremonially. No one ate them, not after what Sister Inez confessed that one time. Historians still argue whether Celsa's theology was entirely sincere or a clever way to impose kitchen discipline under the guise of mystical insight. One skeptical scholar even called her the Saint Teresa of side dishes. Others suggest her method was proto-psychological, a way of externalizing guilt through pickling. But let's be honest, have you ever shouted into a jar of brined onions and felt better afterward? You kneel now beside the shelf, peering into the oldest jar, murky but still sealed. There's something oddly reverent about it. The cucumbers, once crisp, have given themselves fully to the brine, softened, surrendered translucent in the light. If you squint, you almost see a little halo of air rising to the surface, and then the door behind you creaks open. It's Sister Bernadine, the unofficial abbey historian and full-time gossip enthusiast. She smiles at the sight of you crouched beside the virtue jars. Celsa's brine, she says, squinting. That one's forgiven more envy than 3 bishops combined. You laugh softly. She winks, closes the door, and you're alone again. Surrounded by quiet jars, thick air, and a sense that sometimes transformation is a little salty, a little sour, and very, very slow. The bells have chimed. Sex the midday prayer, and most of the sisters are gathered in the chapel, now heads bowed, voices gently murmuring psalms in Latin. But you're not there. You've slipped into the storage room behind the kitchen, a place rarely visited by visitors' novices, or even the abbess herself, unless the inventory demanded it. And here, in this forgotten corner, you find the pots with personality, stacked high on wooden shelves, covered in soft linens to ward off dust and light, are the vessels that held the convent's prized pickles. But these aren't your average crocks or mason jars. These are works of art, clay pots, hand-shaped by nuns during quiet hours, fired in the convent's own kiln, and then painted with the kind of gentle absurdity only lifelong celibacy and a surplus of free time can inspire. You lift a cloth and find a bright blue jar with a startled rabbit etched into its surface mid-leap, surrounded by swirling vines. The label on the bottom reads Turnips 11311, Sister R. Another reveals a smiling sun with pickles dangling like earrings from its rays. One jar has a lid sculpted into the shape of a bishop's hat. You assume that one was made during a particularly mischievous Lent. Mainstream historical sources mention monastic pottery. Of course, convents were often self-sufficient. But the level of artistic whimsy in some of these jars that's not in the official records. It survives in marginalia, in oral tradition, and in notes like the one you find inside a jar, to be opened only on feast days, or if Sister Agnes gets too smug again. There was pride in this artistry. The abbey's pottery wheel, passed down through generations, was considered nearly sacred, and each sister who trained on it left behind a signature style. Sister Teresa's pots had scalloped edges. Sister Hilda added faint floral patterns. Sister Lucia tiny frogs, always just out of sight near the base. The quirky detail here is that some of these pots were rumored to be enchanted, not in a scary medieval witchcraft way, more like mildly magical. One jar was said to hiss if a novice tried to open it before the pickling period was complete. Another sang when lifted, though most now believe it simply had a cracked lid that whistled in the breeze. Still, no one touches that one anymore. You run your fingers over a particularly beautiful vessel, deep green glaze, swirled like lake water, with gold leaf highlights worn to a warm patina. This one, we're told, held the abbey's divine cucumbers, a batch preserved in wine vinegar, crushed juniper berries, and a sprig of mint placed under a waning moon. Sister Adela swore they were perfectly balanced. She also claimed to have seen Saint Scholastica in a spoonful of beet relish, so maybe temper your expectations. Historians still argue whether these elaborate jars were unique to this convent or part of a larger, undocumented trend. Some scholars think the nuns saw the act of beautifying their food containers as a form of resistance, finding color, humor, and identity in a life often reduced to silence and duty. Others say it was just what happened when you gave 50 women access to paint in a quiet afternoon. You reach for one final jar nestled near the back and pause. Its lid is different. Instead of clay, it's carved wood, delicately etched with lines that spiral inward like a labyrinth. The note beside it reads, "For the journeyer, you don't open it, not yet. Instead, you sit there for a while surrounded by pots, with faces jars with jokes containers that once held cucumbers and now cradle stories." The afternoon light shifts, casting long shadows that stretch across the shelves. Somewhere in the courtyard, laughter bubbles up again. A novice sneezes. Someone drops a spoon. The word jarred and brined continues turning. And just like that, another vessel is made sacred, not because of what it holds, but because of how it was held. The sun is sliding toward late afternoon, now casting that syrupy golden light across the convent's stone walls, and you find yourself drawn toward the garden again. But not the usual herb patches or the bramble-bordered vegetable beds. No, today, your curiosity nudges you toward the shadow of controversy, a quiet tale with ripples that still raise eyebrows in the convent library. You're here to witness the cucumber controversy. It began, as so many monastic dramas do, with a well-intentioned question and a badly timed remark. The setting, the refectory during silent lunch. The cause Sister Magdalene's decision to serve fresh, unbrined cucumbers on a feast day. Sounds harmless, but not in 1294. You see, cucumbers weren't exactly trusted in the Middle Ages. According to some monastic interpretations of ancient medical texts, especially those rooted in Galenic theory, cucumbers were considered cold and moist, which, as far as humoral balance went, was practically heresy on a plate. Food had to nourish the soul, not disrupt it with excess water and spiritual dampness. Mainstream historical texts do mention this aversion. Some even note cucumbers were thought to cause melancholy or worse indifference to prayer. and in a nunnery where every emotion had a theological counterweight that was no small matter. So when Sister Magdalene laid out a salad of raw cucumber slices, garnished with mint and rosé vinegar, it wasn't greeted with the silent gratitude she'd expected. Instead, the abbess paused, looked down, and slowly put her fork away. No one else touched their plate. One nun quietly wept into her soup. Historians still argue whether this event was blown out of proportion or genuinely scandalous. There are conflicting reports in the surviving kitchen logs. One notes cryptically greens delivered. Controversy ensued, mint confiscated. The quirky fallout. For nearly 5 years, cucumbers were banned from the convent garden entirely, replaced with radishes, parsnips, and something called holy turnips that no one liked, but everyone pretended to. Sister Magdalene was not punished per se, but she was reassigned to candle making officially, due to her steady hands unofficially, because she couldn't be trusted with menus anymore. Of course, not all sisters agreed. A small pro-cucumber faction emerged quietly, fermenting support in whispered conversations, and accidentally bringing cucumbers in under the guise of decorative gourds. One particularly bold novice carved a cucumber into the shape of St. Clair, holding a jar. It was confiscated. She later carved it again, but this time added a halo made of leek. You sit now under a fig tree near the old garden wall, listening as Sister Bernadine recounts the tale with her usual flair for scandal. They say the real reason wasn't the cucumber's humors, she whispers, but that the abbess simply hated anything sliced too thinly, said it tempted imprecision. You glance toward the newer garden beds, where a few young cucumber vines now grow in quiet defiance. Their leaves flutter in the breeze, innocent, unaware of the chaos their ancestors caused. And then there's the hidden part, the old garden plot sealed off for decades, where rumor says the forbidden cucumbers were buried. A tiny makeshift shrine once stood there, a carved stone with the word crispum etched faintly on it, meaning both curled and crispy. No one knows who placed it or why, but you can imagine a group of nuns late one evening sneaking through the garden with shovels, whispering apologies to the cucumbers and gently laying them to rest in consecrated soil. And just like that, another day ends with soft laughter and the rustle of leaves, where scandal gave way to satire and satire to sleepy nostalgia. Twilight creeps in, draping the convent in violet hues and long shadows. You follow the sound of gentle footsteps and find yourself inside the scriptorium, a room usually reserved for quiet study, gentle copying, and the occasional passive-aggressive throat clearing. But tonight, it's become something else entirely. You've arrived just in time for a rarely mentioned ritual, the pickle prayers. It starts with a hush more profound than silence. A few sisters gather near the corner desk, where a battered but beloved manuscript lies open. It's not a Bible or a rule of St. Benedict. It's something stranger. A homemade devotional known as Canticle of the Brines, stitched together from scraps of psalms, vegetable guides, and household wisdom passed down through generations. At its center is the tale of the lid scroll. According to convent lore, Sister Emerentia once discovered a tightly rolled bit of parchment hidden in the underside of a pickle jar lid. It was small, no bigger than a walnut, and stained with brine. But when she unrolled it carefully with tweezers made from goose quills, she found an original psalm written in fine Latin script, though no one could ever verify who'd written it. The words praised transformation, preservation, and the stillness of sealed things. O ye jars of patience, it began, let thine lids not falter, nor leak, for in brine is faith sustained. Sister Emerentia naturally considered it a miracle, or at the very least, extremely poetic. Mainstream historians raise eyebrows at the story, citing the suspiciously convenient timing and lack of corroborating evidence. But the jar in question, allegedly a crock of pickled leeks, was preserved for over 2 centuries, passed around various abbeys as a holy object, until it finally shattered during transport when a cart hit a goat. The goat was unharmed, the leeks were not. Still, the text survived. Sister Emerentia transcribed it by hand, and from then on, some abbeys began composing short prayers to accompany each batch of pickles. These were not grand hymns, more like whispered affirmations. Lines like, "May this brine never cloud with regret," or "Let the carrots be humble and the radishes bold." Tonight, Sister Therese reads a newly written prayer aloud, her voice soft as dusk. For every slice submerged, let there be patience, for every seed renewal, and for every lid sealed silence, strong and kind. You feel something in the room shift, not holiness exactly, but a shared softness. The kind that happens when several people believe in the same odd thing at the same odd time. The quirky tidbit, one of the most famous pickle prayers, was miswritten due to an ink blot. What was meant to be "Preserve us, O Lord," ended up reading "Pester us, O Lord." For decades, a generation of nuns unknowingly recited this, and one chronicle notes they experienced an unusual string of minor inconveniences. You glance around the room now, taking in the flickering candlelight, the gentle rustle of robes, the way the words settle over the old floor like a balm. A few novices hold their jars as the prayer ends, pressing their palms against the cool glass, whispering names of the vegetables inside, as if greeting old friends. And there, nestled in a niche near the back of the room, sits a single jar, no label, just a smudge of ink in the shape of a tiny cross. You don't touch it, but you feel its presence, quiet, fermented, holy. And just like that, the pickle prayers conclude not with an amen, but with the soft click of lids closing. The candles have been snuffed one by one, and the convent slips into its evening hush. But in the kitchen, long after the last bowl has been washed and the breadboard wiped down with lavender water, something bubbles beneath the silence. You're here for one of the most disputed culinary episodes in Abbey history, the medieval menu drama. Tonight, the kitchen sisters gather around a battered recipe board, still stained from generations of experimentation debate and at least one jelly bean-related heresy. And at the center of this tension is the humble pickled turnip. It might not sound like much, but in the winter of 1317 it was everything. The incident the abbey cook, Sister Benedicta, newly assigned and dangerously optimistic, served pickled turnips twice in 1 week. Once at Wednesday supper, again on Sunday's feast table. That alone would have been cause for concern. But she didn't stop there. No, she also garnished the Sunday plate with rosemary as a creative flourish, an act which, according to the convent's elder sister, tempted the Lord's patience and the digestive tract alike. Mainstream food historians note that turnips were among the most common preserved vegetables in the medieval world, especially during harsh winters. But even the most devout preservationist agreed that their pungency was a lot. To serve them twice in quick succession without a vinegar variation bordered on reckless. The drama unfolded with the quiet ferocity only a convent could produce. Passive-aggressive prayer notes were left on Sister Benedicta's kneeling. A jar labeled Turnip Redemption mysteriously appeared in her cell, and during evening vespers, someone altered a hymn refrain from "O Lord, grant us peace" to "O Lord, grant us peace." To this day, no one admits to the musical sabotage, the quirky part. One of the novices, perhaps sensing an opportunity, began crafting alternative turnip recipes in secret. She mashed them with honey, layered them with pickled cherries, even attempted something called brine pudding that was banned after an unfortunate communal hiccup. Sister Benedicta, to her credit, responded with grace. She issued a formal apology, written on pressed onion skin parchment naturally, and fasted from recipe improvisation for a full month. In an addendum, she included a poem, "Let not my turnips turn your heart. Forgive the brine embrace, fresh start." Historians still argue whether the poem was heartfelt or passive-aggressive in rhyme. The best part: that year's winter journal refers to the event as the root-vegetable reconciliation. From then on, a new rule was quietly adopted. No pickled vegetable may appear more than once every 7 meals. To track this, a sister was appointed menu mistress, armed with a quill, a scroll, and a mildly judgmental expression. You sit now at the corner of the kitchen hearth, listening as Sister Juliana tells the story for the 100th time, giggling behind her hand, and that she says sipping her turnip broth with exaggerated relish is why we now have 4 different types of brine rotation. The kitchen warms around you, flames low jars clinking gently as they cool. On a shelf nearby, an old turnip jar still sits its lid slightly crooked, labeled in faded ink, "Twice blessed, never again." And just like that, another chapter of culinary caution becomes a bedtime tale, retold with equal parts vinegar and affection. Night has settled into earnest now. The moonlight spills across the cloister walkways like pale silver cloth, and the scent of lavender and basil drifts lazily from the cooling garden beds. But deeper inside the abbey, behind a half-concealed wooden door, and down a staircase, worn soft by centuries of sandals, you follow the whispers of one of the strangest abbey tales on record. It's time to revisit the spicy scandal of St. Brine. It began innocently enough with a shipment of mustard seeds. You step into the convent's old spice cellar, cool, dry, and slightly dusty. The shelves are a mosaic of little jars and folded pouches, each labeled in a spidery hand. Coriander for digestion. Saffron, do not hoard fenugreek, ask before using, but it's the mustard that caused all the trouble. Sister Perpetua, a spirited woman with a sharp nose and a sharper sense of culinary daring, had been experimenting with stronger flavors in her pickles. Inspired by tales from a traveling friar who'd once tasted North African cuisine, she ordered an excessive amount of mustard seeds through a discreet merchant contact. Mainstream historians acknowledge that spice trade routes by the late 13th century were becoming more robust, and mustard was becoming increasingly accessible in wealthy circles. But in a quiet, cloistered convent, using such a bold, heat-forward spice in a pickle was well borderline secular. The first batch was met with confusion. The second batch, however, sparked division. Sister Benedicta claimed it burned her contemplation. Sister Agnes, ever dramatic, called it demonic zest. But Sister Perpetua remained unrepentant. The Lord gave us tongues, she said, and the mustard reminds them they are still alive. The abbess convened an emergency flavor council. Yes, that was a thing. It typically reviewed new herbal combinations for tea, or whether red basil made the broth look too aggressive. But this was its most controversial meeting to date. Witnesses recall a lot of raised eyebrows, and at least one discreet nose blowing into a pickle-scented handkerchief. Historians still argue whether this scandal was about theology tradition or just bad communication. One theory suggests it was less about the mustard and more about Sister Perpetua's habit of bypassing the communal recipe scroll, a serious offense in an order where collaboration was a form of worship. The quirky detail. Someone anonymously illustrated the entire event in the margins of the Abbey's spice inventory. Tiny ink drawings depict mustard seeds marching across a table, flanked by outraged turnips and weeping onions. One image shows a jar with flames shooting from its lid, captioned simply, "Too bold." In the end, a compromise was reached. A separate section of the pantry was designated experimental, and Sister Perpetua was asked to label her creations more clearly. She agreed begrudgingly and began naming her jars with elaborate Latin phrases like fortis, in vinegarum strong in the brine, and saporum ad vitam flavor unto life. You sit now on an old wooden stool in the spice cellar, running your fingers along the carved edges of a mustard jar. It's warm to the touch, probably your imagination, or maybe the mustard's still working its way through history. A faint sound, soft giggling, floats down from above. You can imagine them, the sisters in the kitchen, telling the story again. Not with judgment now, but with the fondness of those who know a little rebellion keeps things lively, even in a life devoted to stillness. And just like that, the scandal becomes legend, softened over time into something even spicier affection. You wake, if you were even asleep, to the faint sound of sandals padding across flagstones and the muffled jingle of something metal. Lantern light flickers around a corner. A sister passes you with quiet purpose, carrying a small satchel, a walking staff, and... is that a travel-sized jar of pickles? Yes it is. Tonight, you join the sisters on a quiet and peculiar journey, the pickle pilgrimage. Now, most medieval pilgrimages involved hardship relics and a lot of foot blisters. But this is softer, stranger, brined. It starts with a rumor passed from abbey to abbey in the margins of recipe books and the backs of hymnals. A tale of a jar sealed by Saint Brynia herself, a possibly fictional but deeply beloved folk figure, stored 3 convents away and said to contain the holiest preserved beet in Christendom. Mainstream scholars have dismissed the story for centuries, but that didn't stop Sister Imelda from organizing a small devotional journey in the late 1400s to investigate. What started as a 2-day trip to the next diocese became an 8-week expedition, during which 3 nuns returned with walking sticks, 2 sprained ankles, 1 dog, and a renewed appreciation for sturdy sandals. The quirky twist. Along the way, The sisters developed a ritual at each stop. They would present a jar of their own homemade pickles to the host convent in exchange for one of theirs. The result was an ever-growing and deeply eclectic brine bag filled with vinegary treasures from across the region. One jar contained pickled violets and green walnuts. Another soaked garlic scapes in rose vinegar that allegedly cured Sister Marina's snoring. You sit on a low bench now, just inside the abbey gate, watching as a younger group of sisters recreates the pilgrimage less for relics, more for community. They walk with purpose, led by Sister Odile, who carries a carved wooden walking stick topped with a gherkin-shaped finial. Each sister has her own offering. One cradles a jar of spiced beets, another fermented plum slices. One has something murky and bright green that no one asks about. They wear linen sashes embroidered with cucumbers, and their sandals are dusted with flour from an earlier kitchen shift. Historians still argue whether the original pilgrimage was ever sanctioned or simply tolerated as a harmless outlet for travel cravings. Some believe the tale of St. Brennia's beet was invented as a cover story to get out of kitchen duty. Others more romantically say the jar really existed but cracked quietly during a summer thunderstorm and was eaten by a very old dog named Lot. Tonight, though, none of that matters. The sisters leave at dusk, walking 2 by 2, singing a soft chant with revised lyrics. Blessed are the pickled, for they shall be preserved. You trail them for a moment, the cool air thick with the scent of crushed mint and old stone. One novice turns back and grins. We'll bring back something good, she says. Hopefully not more turnips. And just like that, they vanish beyond the gate into the brined unknown, chasing stories, wrapped in vinegar and wonder. The next morning arrives wrapped in dew and a few overripe pears, thudding to the ground behind the kitchen shed. You stretch inhale the peppery scent of nasturtiums from the garden and shuffle toward the greenhouse. It's the quieter side of the abbey, the sun-warmed sanctuary, where things grow under watchful eyes and occasionally contentious opinions. Today, the topic is dill, and you lucky pilgrim of peaceful absurdity have wandered straight into the dill debate. It's older than the walls, older than the orchard, possibly older than the abbey itself, depending on whom you ask. The argument whether dill has a rightful place in the sacred act of pickling. You wouldn't think a soft herb with feathery fronds could provoke decades of monastic squabble, but oh, you'd be wrong. One group of sisters, let's call them the traditionalists, insist. Dill overwhelms the purity of the brine. They believe the pickle should speak for itself, sour, sharp, unflinching. These sisters use only garlic salt and thyme, nothing green, nothing frilly, the opposing camp. The dill devotees argue that dill is not only permissible, but spiritually beneficial. Its seeds, one nun wrote in a side note of a psalter, remind us of divine order, its fronds of humility. She was later accused of stealing extra sprigs from the communal herb basket and given 2 weeks of silence, which she apparently used to compose an ode to parsley. But that's another scandal. Mainstream records are mostly silent on the matter because, frankly, the outside world did not care. But within abbey walls, the debate took root. Greenhouses were split down the middle. Gardens were partitioned. Some herb beds even had signs, "No dill past this point." In one case, an entire order in southern Burgundy banned dill outright and replaced it with tarragon, a bold move. Some called it culinary exile. You find yourself now standing in the middle of the abbey's own divided greenhouse. To the left, neat rows of thyme sage and rosemary. To the right, a lush jungle of dill so fragrant it could knock out a moderately sensitive nun. The quirky detail. A few years ago, during a truce called the Great Herb Accord, the abbess allowed both factions to enter a friendly competition. Each group produced its own signature pickle. The dill devotees crafted a cucumber spear soaked in lemony brine and crowned with blossoms. The traditionalists presented a turnip slice, so sour it nearly dissolved the tasting spoon. The vote ended in a tie, though one novice claimed her palate had transcended. She was later sent to help the beekeeper calm down a particularly aggressive hive. Historians still argue whether the dill ban was about flavor power or plain personality conflict. One theory suggests it had less to do with herbs and more with Sister Justina's jealousy over Sister Adela's perfect spiral cuts. You crouch now, brushing your fingers along the soft dill fronds. A bee lingers lazily nearby. In the distance, someone's chanting or sneezing, could be both. You close your eyes and imagine the two factions seated side by side in the refectory, eating each other's pickles in polite silence and muttering interesting flavor while plotting recipe revisions. And just like that, the greenhouse becomes a house of peace again, at least until next planting season. Later that day, you trail a group of sisters into the far end of the garden, the part they call Little Eden, though it's mostly raised beds, sun-bleached scarecrows, and one pigeon that seems to have appointed itself Bishop of Lettuce. This is where things get practical. Welcome to Nun-Approved Garden Hacks Medieval Edition. The sun is hot, but not cruel. The sisters work in rhythm robes, hitched slightly above their ankles, straw hats tilted at just the right angle to shade both eyes and opinions. A novice waves a goose feather tied to a reed over a patch of cucumbers. It looks ridiculous. It also works. Most medieval convents managed their own food supply. That included elaborate gardens, composting systems, and careful planning around soil health, though they'd never call it that. They'd just say, the Lord prefers the north bed for turnips. Mainstream agricultural records from the period often credit monks with advancements in gardening, but nuns had tricks of their own. Tricks they whispered over steaming jars and behind windbreaks made of cabbages. Some were scientific, some were superstition, and some were just brilliant improvisation. Take the raised beds. These weren't just for drainage, they were strategically placed to keep vegetables from sulking in the convent's low-lying areas. Sister Melania, an early innovator, discovered that by lining the bottom of the bed with crushed eggshells, she could deter snails and spiritless growth. Whether that last bit referred to weeds or enthusiasm remains unclear. You kneel beside a particularly lush cucumber patch. Its vines are supported not with twine, but with braided strips of old scapulars, worn-out habits recycled and sanctified through gardening. One sister murmurs that these cucumbers grow straighter because they've been clothed in virtue. Quirky tidbit. A long-standing abbey legend claims that if you whisper your intention into a seed before planting it, will grow accordingly. Sister Gertrude once whispered modesty into a row of carrots. They came up comically short. She never lived it down. A few feet away, You watch Sister Magdalene water her radishes with moon water, a jar left overnight under a full moon, supposedly infused with gentle grace. Historians still argue whether this was mystical gardening or simply a way to avoid hauling water during the day. Either way, her radishes are suspiciously symmetrical. Some sisters claim that singing to cucumbers helps them grow straighter. Others swear by sprinkling ash around tomato roots to ward off root envy, which may or may not be a real condition. And then there's the goose feather. It turns out, dangling one over sprouting vines mimics a gentle breeze. But this trick also came from a minor miracle. Years ago, a novice fell asleep, holding a feather, and woke to find her wilting cucumbers perked up as if revived by angel breath. Since then, feathers have been part of the garden toolkit, light blessed and slightly ridiculous. You sink into the shade of a mulberry tree now, listening to the quiet thrum of bees, the swish of watering cans, and the occasional crunch of gravel as a sister hauls another basket to the brining table. Every jar you've seen, every pickle you've tasted, started here in dirt and patience in seeds, spoken to like children, and in vines draped lovingly over crooked trellises made from old broom handles and hope. And just like that, you understand the garden isn't just where food begins. It's where reverence grows alongside the cucumbers. Evening has settled once more, and the scriptorium glows with the soft golden light of beeswax candles. You drift back inside past the long reading desks and shelves of crumbling vellum and find something curious at the far end, an open, illuminated manuscript, its gold leaf still shimmering, its margins alive with color and mischief. You've arrived at the most delightfully confusing corner of the Abbey's history, illuminated pickles. Yes, really. If you thought medieval manuscripts were only filled with saints, dragons, and occasional peacocks doing strange things, think again. Because nestled among the psalters and prayer books of this Abbey's collection are at least 3 volumes where cucumbers, onions, and most notably gherkins feature heavily in the marginalia. Mainstream medieval art scholars often point out that monastic doodles were far from pious. Monks and nuns filled the borders of their sacred texts with snails jousting knights, monkeys baking pies, and cats playing musical instruments. But here in this convent's quiet alcove, the pickles took center stage. You run your finger along the edge of a page where a tiny monk is being offered a brined beet by a nun riding a goose. On another page, a cucumber wears a halo. Beneath it, a tiny scroll reads, "Blessed be thy crispness." It's Sister Euphemia's work. She lived during the mid-1200s, and while trained as a scribe, was notorious for adding unauthorized embellishments to sacred texts. Her style fine lines bold colors and a suspicious affection for vegetables with facial expressions. The quirky twist. One entire margin chronicles the parable of Saint Philomena and the pickled eggplant, a wholly invented tale involving humility vinegar and a talking donkey. No one ever formally challenged it. Some say the abbess at the time actually liked the donkey's dialogue. You flip to a page where 2 gherkins joust with toothpicks, while a crowd of carrot spectators looks on in wonder. One wears a tiny banner reading Order of the Blessed Brine. Another image shows a nun sleeping under a canopy of dill. Historians still debate whether Euphemia was gently mocking her sisters or expressing a deeper kind of spiritual metaphor. perhaps both. One thing is certain, her work endured. Her books were not burned or censored, but carefully preserved, tucked into corners of the library, marked with faint ink notes, like fun, but possibly heretical. You turn another page and see something that makes you pause. A cucumber, gently cradled in a nun's arms, swaddled like an infant. Below it, the caption reads, "All things brined shall be comforted." Sister Bernadine shuffles over, now peering down at the image. Euphemia, she sighs. Too much time alone with pigments and pickled thoughts. She chuckles, then pulls a folded piece of modern parchment from her sleeve. A novice, she explains, recently found a scrap of manuscript in the back of a cupboard. On it, a half-finished sketch of what appears to be a turnip chapel, the roof lettuce, the door a beet slice. The altar, unmistakably, is a jar. And just like that, you realize what these images are not mockery, but memory. A way to preserve not just vegetables, but joy, humor, the unspoken warmth that makes even silence feel full. You sit back in the candlelight, the scent of aged parchment and elderberry ink swirling gently around you. A cucumber knight tips its tiny lance toward a grinning leek. Somewhere behind you, the abbey bell tolls once soft, round, forgiving. And just like that, even the margins become holy. Later that night, the abbey is still. Wind rustles the high windows. A distant owl hoots once, then again like a sleepy monk asking to be left alone. You pad softly down a narrow hallway rarely used except on feast days. At the end, a small alcove glows with lamplight. A few sisters are gathered around something on a low table, voices hushed but full of awe. You've arrived just in time to see a jar fit for the Virgin. It's not a metaphor. It's an actual pickle jar, large, luminous, and absurdly ornate. Gold leaf traces the rim. The sides are painted with delicate miniature scenes, nuns harvesting cucumbers, saints blessing root vegetables, and most curiously, a winged beet floating above a bowl of vinegar. This jar is the stuff of abbey legend. According to tradition, it was created in the late 1300s by Sister Adaltrudis, a painter herbalist and self-proclaimed brine visionary. She believed that devotion could be channeled into everyday objects, so naturally, she spent an entire Lent gilding a pickle jar. Mainstream records don't mention Sister Adaltrudis, but the jar exists. It sits in a recessed stone niche, surrounded by small votive candles and one oddly reverent wooden spoon. An engraved plaque below it reads, "To preserve, to pray, to pickle." The jar itself once held a batch of violet-infused pickled onions. According to legend, they were never intended to be eaten. Sister Adaltrudis made them as an offering, an edible votive preserved with such care and ceremony that she considered them too holy for the tongue. The onions have since dissolved into an amber-hued syrup, and the brine has pulled away from the edges like a shrinking tide, but the reverence remains. You watch as a novice reaches toward the glass, not to touch, just to hover. Her lips move, a prayer, a wish, or maybe just a word of thanks to the sisters who turned daily chores into golden devotion. The quirky detail hidden on the jar's underside is a small painted figure, Sister Adaltrudis herself, crouched over a turnip, looking both proud and slightly unhinged. She signed it, Fiat Brenum, a made-up Latin phrase. The sisters translate as "let there be brine." Historians still argue whether the jar was ever meant to be sacred, or if Otto Trudis was simply bored and artistically gifted. Some say she hoped the jar would become a relic. Others say she once tried to submit it to a regional art show under the category theological containers. The abbess at the time allegedly banned her from gold leaf for 2 years. But tonight, no one debates its meaning. The jar glows like a lantern, its imperfect curves catching the flicker of the candles, its preserved contents still shifting slowly in their sleep. A jar that outlived its maker, outlasted its onions, and became something more than a vessel. You lean against the cool wall nearby, letting the quiet settle around you. A sister begins humming a tune you don't know, but it wraps around the jar like ribbon. In that moment, you understand the line between ridiculous and reverent is thinner than a sliver of garlic. And just like that, the jar becomes not just a curiosity, but a kind of gospel. The next morning, the bell rings for terse, mid-morning prayers, but you find yourself skipping the chapel. Instead, you follow Sister Juliana down a narrow hallway that smells faintly of ink glue and what might be pickled eggplant. She leads you into a small room where the windows are shuttered and sunlight filters in like spilled milk. There's a low table in the middle, stacked with scrolls and scraps of parchment, each one covered in tidy lettering and flourishes. Welcome to the world of the pickled alphabet. It all began as a teaching tool. Sister Matrona, centuries ago, was assigned to train the newest novices in their letters. But rather than use saints' names or animals like every other copyist, she decided to anchor each letter to the abbey's pride and joy, its vegetables. So began the famous abecedarium, Brinum, or the brined alphabet. A is for allium onion, B is for brassica cabbage, C is for cucumis cucumber, and so on all the way to Z, which was admittedly a stretch, and became zingiber or ginger, which they didn't grow but had read about in exotic merchant scrolls and desperately wanted to. Mainstream historians sometimes dismiss such creative alphabets as novelties, but fragments of the brined alphabet survive in more than one abbey archive. Some even show signs of heavy use, faded edges, thumbprints, and the occasional greasy spot in the margins. Apparently, the novices practiced writing while actively working in the kitchens, labeling jars, or copying devotional lines onto ribbon tags tied around crocks. You pick up one such tag now. It reads, "D. Dill shall guide the faithful." It's in Sister Matrona's handwriting, loopy confident, a little too fond of oversized ampersands. The quirky bit. At least one version of the brined alphabet included tiny illustrations for each letter, hand-painted by a particularly dramatic novice who insisted every vegetable needed a face. Her cucumbers wore spectacles. Her onions cried real tears drawn in glittering ink. Her leeks wore robes. Some believed this was sacrilegious. Others considered it charming. The abbess allowed it under the condition that no one ever put a mustache on the blessed gourd again. Apparently someone did, once. You glance around the room now, taking in the layers of parchment, the smell of vinegar and dried ink, the faint creak of quill pens long silenced. One scroll in the corner is tied with a blue ribbon and marked simply Sister Sabina's Secret Pickle Proverbs. You open it just enough to read the first line. He who rushes the brine gets only sourness. She who waits gets clarity. Historians still argue whether the scriptural tone was serious or just a sleepy pun, but the sisters here recite those lines like psalms. At a nearby desk, a novice practices her script, carefully writing L is for leek, long-suffering, and useful in soups. Her tongue sticks out in concentration. You smile. Somewhere in the garden, a leek probably sensed it was being praised. And just like that, even language bends toward vinegar, each letter infused with salt patience and just a little joy. It's market day, though you wouldn't know it from the silence inside the abbey walls. Outside down the hill and through the village square, carts rattle over cobblestones, geese honk indignantly, and merchants shout about onions, goats, and questionable wool. But here in the convent's old granary-turned-pickling room, something a little less holy and a lot more entrepreneurial is taking shape. You're about to witness the secret side hustle of the sisters' cloistered commerce. Now, officially, the abbey didn't sell pickles. That would have been improper. Monastic vows, after all, included poverty, and turning a profit off a fermented turnip could get you in real trouble with the bishop. But that didn't stop the more creative abbeys from adjusting the model. Mainstream historical records rarely address the quiet economies of convents, but behind the scenes, many were hubs of production, herbal remedies, textiles, ink bread, and yes, to pickled vegetables. Wealthy patrons often donated in exchange for goods, which was not selling per se, just spiritually motivated gift exchange. You sit now beside a long table covered in paper wrappings, ribbon spools, and several jars of cucumbers so expertly packed they look like stained glass windows. A nun with sharp eyes and sharper handwriting, Sister Ottilia sits at the head of the table, dipping a quill into ink as she copies delivery labels. Lady de Villaine, 2 jars lemon brine, no pepper. To the kitchen of Baron M, do not shake. These weren't black market deals. These were acts of generosity met with unsolicited thank you gifts in the form of wool flour, or in one famous case, a golden candlestick that Sister Ottilia turned into a pickle press. The quirky twist. Some abbeys developed house brands. They stitched little linen tags with their initials, sealed jars with colored wax, and even created seasonal releases. Sister Juliana once made a holiday chutney so beloved by a local countess that she declared it spiritually superior to confession. The abbess very carefully noted the compliment, but refused to reduce anyone's penance over condiments. Of course, not everyone in the convent agreed with this little economy. There was a brief uprising in 1342 when the cloister's older sisters discovered that Sister Ottilia had been experimenting with gift baskets. One included pickled cherries, rose salt, and a small poem titled Psalm of the Plum. It was deemed too cozy and promptly discontinued. Historians still argue whether the commerce was truly clandestine or simply a well-managed gray area. Some believe these exchanges helped the abbeys survive during lean harvest years. Others claim it was merely a clever way to stay connected to the outside world without actually speaking to anyone. You peer now into a basket prepared for shipment. Nestled inside, wrapped in clean cloth and tied with twine, is a jar labeled Consolation Brine for cold nights and cold guests. You can't help but wonder how many noble households once gathered around a stone hearth, passing around a spoonful of convent pickles, like holy wine not knowing they were tasting more than vinegar. They were tasting silent soil and an order of women who found meaning in mustard seed and mint. A bell rings softly outside. A donkey brays. Sister Ottilia rolls her eyes and says he's early again before rising to meet the delivery boy. And just like that, another sacred shipment of jars leaves the abbey not sold, not bartered, simply gifted with love flavor and just enough paperwork to keep the bishop happy. It's well past Compline now. Most of the abbey sleeps curled into cots, cloaked in silence heads, full of psalms and grocery lists. But your night isn't quite done. One narrow hallway glows faintly with candlelight, and the scent wafting from beneath the door is unmistakable, briny, herbal, sharp with garlic, and is that lavender? You step inside and find a circle of sisters gathered around a low table, each one cradling a small corked jar. They look serious, reverent, sleepy. Welcome to one of the most peculiar late-night devotions in convent history. Brine as blessing water. It started, they say, with Sister Claricia, a woman prone to vivid dreams and strange convictions. One night, after an especially stormy Lent, she claimed a voice told her that vinegar, particularly when steeped with mint and caraway, could drive away restless thoughts and the nocturnal temptations of starch. Mainstream scholars tend to smile politely and move on, but the sisters took it seriously. Soon, tiny jars of blessing brine began appearing on nightstands throughout the abbey. They weren't meant for eating. These were steeped mixtures of herbs and salt water, sometimes tinged pink with beetroot or blue with borage flowers. Each one was gently corked and kept nearby as a sort of spiritual mothball, fending off bad dreams, sour moods, and whatever else might sneak in between matins and sunrise. The quirky detail Sister Claricia insisted the brine had to be inhaled, not sprinkled. Just before bed, she'd uncork her jar, take a slow breath, and mutter, "May no unseasoned spirit trouble my rest." Some sisters adopted the ritual immediately. Others rolled their eyes until the night Sister Aladiah had a week of uninterrupted dreams after sleeping beside a particularly garlicky batch. Coincidence maybe, but word spread. Soon, dream jars became a fixture of abbey life. Each sister customized her own Sister Beatrix, swore by fennel and lemon balm. Sister Domitilla preferred rosewater and sage, and one anonymous jar left on the windowsill each full moon simply read, "For traveling dreams only." You kneel now beside the table as Sister Juliana demonstrates the process. She uncorks her jar, lets the scent rise, and whispers something under her breath. Then she gently tips a few drops onto her palms, rubs them together, and pats her temples. The vinegar opens the mind, she says. The mint closes the door behind it. Historians still argue whether these jars were part of the genuine monastic practice, or just one of many creative expressions born from quiet hours and a shortage of proper candles. Some claim the brine's efficacy lay in its ritual, the intentional breath, the quiet moment, the belief. Others think it was the garlic. You lean back against the wall, your eyes closed, the scent of one sister's blessing blend number 3 hovering in the air. It smells like thyme clove and whatever hope smells like when it's been simmered all afternoon in vinegar. Outside, an owl calls once again, and just like that, the room falls into silence. The jars are corked, the candles dimmed, The sisters, brine-blessed and peaceful, slip off to bed. One jar remains on the table, yours for the night. The label reads, "In case of troubling dreams or troubling turnips." It's a little after midnight now, and the abbey is deep in its soft, habitual stillness, or it should be, because somewhere through one corridor, past a cloaked window, and beneath a worn wooden arch, you hear it, the unmistakable sound of sandals, not walking, sneaking. You hold your breath. The hallway glows faintly with moonlight. A breeze rustles a nearby linen curtain, then a quiet creak, a hinge that really should have been oiled during Lent. You've arrived at the scene of a long whispered legend, the midnight pickle theft. The story retold endlessly by novices, and always accompanied by dramatic gasps, begins with Sister Felicitas, a novice at the time, known for two things: a habit of tasting without asking, and an almost supernatural sense of smell when it came to brined carrots. One night, craving something sharp and sour, she snuck into the storage cellar and opened a jar labeled "Reserved for Feast of Saint Gerarda, do not touch." The next morning, the jar was discovered half full. Sister Felicitas claimed innocence, of course, but the orange stains on her fingertips suggested otherwise. That was the first incident. It wasn't the last. Mainstream abbey logs from the late 1200s mention several cases of unauthorized brining access. Some entries are stern security of the lower pantry remains insufficient. Others are poetic. A thief walks among the crocks, vinegar on her breath. Sister Constance famously left a sign on her best batch, "Steal this," and face the full wrath of the vinegar angel. You crouch behind a linen press now, watching as a shadowy figure tiptoes past bare feet, robe slightly too long, and in her hands, a jar. You recognize it. That's the spicy beetroot batch from earlier in the week, the one labeled experimental. Consume at your own risk. Brave. The figure pauses, turns and sees you. She freezes. You both do. Then slowly she lifts one finger to her lips, and disappears around the corner. A soft clink of a spoon echoes down the corridor a moment later. The quirky detail: some abbeys developed what they called Sister Key's wooden tokens, handed out to trusted nuns so they could enter the storage rooms after hours for spiritual nourishment. This worked until someone forged a key out of dried parsnip and nearly broke the lock. Historians still argue whether the thefts were acts of mischief or a protest against uneven pickle distribution. Sister Benedicta's carrot chili blend was, after all, rarely shared. You walk now into the cellar to investigate. It's cooler here. The air is thick with old salt must and faintly lemony regret. One jar is askew just slightly. Its seal broken its label, replaced with one that reads, "Thank you, a friend." There's no punishment, no scandal, just a quiet acknowledgement in the abbess's morning remarks. Let all jars be sealed more firmly. Let all hearts be opened more generously. And just like that, the mystery becomes memory. A tale that grows richer in the retelling, like a properly aged onion. You return to your cot with a faint smile. A jar waits on your nightstand. You didn't put it there. Its lid is tight. The note says, "Peace in garlic and thyme." Dawn creeps in softly, brushing the stone windowsills with honeyed light and waking the convent in its gentle, familiar rhythm bells. Footsteps the sigh of warm wood. But this morning feels different, lighter somehow. Maybe it's the crisp breeze. Maybe it's the lingering dream of pickled beets and mysterious nocturnal jar swapping. You wander out to the garden and find a cluster of nuns sitting beneath the fig tree. They're not working. They're talking openly, freely, smiling in that sleepy way people do when they've been up since matins and have already processed the guilt of an extra spoonful of plum jam at breakfast. You sit down among them and quickly realize what they're doing. They're describing heaven, more specifically, their dream vinegar gardens. Sister Theophania goes first. Mine, she says, has a trellis of dill and sun-warmed benches where the jars sing to you when they're ready. Sister Edmunda sighs wistfully. In mine, the cucumbers hang from the clouds. You don't have to harvest them. They float gently into your arms. Laughter ripples through the group like birds in flight. This isn't doctrine. It's not written in any book. But over centuries, the sisters have created a quiet tradition of imagining their own brined paradises. Places where humility and humor coexist, and every jar seals perfectly on the first try. Mainstream theology scholars tend to ignore such domestic visions of the afterlife. They write about celestial choirs, golden thrones, or eternal contemplation. But here, eternal joy is a row of glossy carrot slices preserved in tarragon vinegar stacked beside a clear running stream of elderflower brine. The quirky part, one of the earliest records of this tradition, comes from a 14th century recipe book where, tucked between instructions for pickled green beans and almond vinegar, someone had written in tiny script, "Heaven is a garden without slugs." You listen now as Sister Beatrix describes her heavenly shed, always swept, always organized with perfect lighting and a dedicated shelf for impossibly crisp things. Another sister chimes in, "Mine has bottomless jars, but you always reach the best piece first." Even the quietest novice speaks up. "I want pickled plums that taste like memory." You close your eyes and imagine your own. A shaded path lined with rosemary and thyme. Jars tucked into ivy-covered alcoves. Bees that hum Gregorian chants. A cool stone bench where St. Brynia herself hands you a silver spoon and says, "Here, try this one. It's been waiting for you." Historians still argue whether such visions were harmless whimsy or a form of monastic mysticism. But one scholar, after reading the full list of dream gardens in a preserved abbey scroll, simply wrote, "If this is heresy, it is the gentlest kind." And just like that, the garden fills not with work, but with wonder. The sun rises higher, a fig drops. Someone suggests cinnamon in today's vinegar. No one disagrees. And heaven for a moment seems very, very close. Midday again. The bell rings for sext, but before the sisters slip into their usual rhythm of prayer and garden duties, there's a murmur in the scriptorium, a hushed excitement that hums just loud enough to draw you in. At the long central table lies a freshly unrolled scroll, not new, not exactly. Old vellum, the edges nibbled slightly by time, but its contents utterly unexpected. You lean in and realize you've stumbled upon a rarely discussed and rarely taken seriously chapter in Abbey lore Pickles in Prophecy. Yes, really, it all started with Sister Wesoria, a reclusive but widely tolerated mystic who lived during a particularly foggy stretch of the 13th century. She was known for two things: speaking in rhymed couplets and refusing to eat anything that hadn't been brined. One stormy evening, during what was either divine revelation or an unfortunate case of spoiled beetroot, Sister Wysoria emerged from her cell and declared, "The sky shall split, the gherkin rise, and vinegar fall from salted skies." What followed was a brief but intense period of interpretive panic. Mainstream historians either ignore or politely scoff at this event, often lumping it in with other minor monastic episodes. But the Abbey's own internal notes suggest that for several weeks in the autumn of 1274, the sisters were genuinely rattled. One chronicler wrote, "Dreams abound and jars tremble, the quirky twist." That same week, a comet passed overhead. It had an oddly curved tail, bent just enough that one sister insisted it looked like a cucumber. The incident came to be known in hushed tones as the Blind Star. Sister Wysoria doubled down. She composed a series of verses known as the Pickled Visions, scrawled on the backs of old recipe sheets. Among her predictions, "When turnips bloom, beware the fog. In the year of double jars, the quietest novice shall speak thunder. Beware the spicy plum." Most of it was nonsense, probably, but just to be safe, spicy plums were quietly banned until 1341. You sit now beside the scroll, watching as Sister Bernadine traces one of the lines with her finger. "We used to recite these during storms," she says, "for comfort or for luck. Depends on who you ask." Above her head, someone has pinned an old illustration to the wall, a comet in the night sky, its tail curling like a pickle, while nuns below lift their jars skyward in solemn offering. Historians still argue whether Isoria's visions were prophetic poetic or just pickled daydreams. But even skeptics admit one thing her brine never spoiled, not once, not ever. And to this day, her last sealed jar remains unopened in the Abbey cellar, marked only with the word "wait." You glance out the window. The sky is perfectly clear. No comets, no blooming turnips. But a faint breeze carries the scent of vinegar and lilac. And just like that, the prophecy feels less like a warning and more like a bedtime story. Sour sacred and strangely soothing. Afternoon sun stretches long across the Abbey's cloister walk, warming the sandstone and making the shadows feel like silk. You've followed a trail of loose sketches and faint ink blots to a room you haven't yet visited, tucked behind the herb-drying shed through a low doorway that smells faintly of juniper and patience. Inside, dust dances in sunbeams that filter through a high window. At the center of the room is a simple wooden desk covered in brushes, half-dried ink pots, and dozens, no hundreds of tiny sheets of parchment. This is the lair of the pickle illuminator. Her name was Sister Agnella. She wasn't the convent's best singer or fastest scribe, but she had one gift no one else could replicate. She could paint vegetables like they were saints. You look around in quiet awe. Each parchment is a miniature marvel. Cucumbers have been rendered with shading so subtle they seem to glisten. Carrots in full regalia, one even wears a crown. An onion with a mournful expression, tears inked in shimmering silver beading on its cheeks. Every jar is lovingly drawn, every label handwritten in precise monastic script. It's not just art, it's adoration. Mainstream monastic histories often highlight the illuminated gospels, calendars, and prayer books made by nuns. But these weren't for liturgical use. Sister Agnella called her works the preserved saints. She believed each vegetable had a personality, a calling, even a story of redemption, and by illustrating them in quiet detail always after prayer, always by daylight, she was offering praise. The quirky detail. She didn't stop with what could be eaten. She illustrated rejected batches too. One page features the failed eggplant with a broken halo and a worm-like smirk. Another shows a cracked jar surrounded by weeping beetroot spirits. In the margin, they were brave, but the seal was weak. The abbess at the time allowed it mostly because the drawings kept Agnella quiet and out of theological debates. But over time, the collection grew, earning its own shelf in the scriptorium. The novices especially adored them, whispering stories about the heroic radish of 1326 and the spiced fig who forgave everyone. Historians still argue whether Agnella was illustrating literal pickles or using them as metaphors for the spiritual journey, how time pressure and salt bring about transformation. One scholar wrote, "Her cucumbers are more human than most monks I've met. You sit at the desk now, lifting a page delicately between your fingers. It shows a cabbage serene and smiling, surrounded by stars and garlic cloves." The title reads Saint Brassica of the cellar patron of leftovers and lingerers. A knock at the door. Sister Bernadine peeks in and raises an eyebrow. She used to say the brine told her what to paint, she says, stepping closer. We thought she was mad until her crying onion sold at a monastery auction for 12 loaves of bread and a goose. She points to a small wooden box under the desk. Inside unfinished sketches, penciled outlines of leeks mid-lament, half-inked peppers holding tiny scrolls, a single pear with a halo captioned awaiting fermentation. And just like that, you realize Agnella wasn't just illustrating vegetables, she was illuminating the overlooked, giving voice to the quiet, the pickled that passed by. You close the box gently. Outside the bell tolls. Another hour gone, another day soaked in salt color and gentle absurdity. And the art, it waits. Still crisp, still glowing. Late afternoon again. The abbey is slipping into that golden quiet, just before vespers, when the air seems heavier with incense and everything tastes a bit like warm bread. You wander through the hall that leads behind the apothecary, normally off-limits to novices, and definitely off-limits to anyone holding a spoon. But that never stopped the nuns. You're about to uncover one of the abbey's tastiest little rebellions, rebellious relish. It started as so many excellent things do, with a secret recipe and a very locked cabinet. Sister Aldegundis was known for being precise. Her jars were symmetrical, her labels straight, her brine-to-vegetable ratios memorized with military discipline. But beneath her spotless apron and calm demeanor, she nursed a forbidden fondness for spice. Not just cloves and cinnamon. We're talking real heat. Crushed chili, black pepper, mace, even a hint of something that may or may not have been mustard oil, from a merchant who absolutely did not declare it to the bishop. She developed a relish more concentrated than a pickle, more chaotic than a chutney. It included pickled pears, garlic, fermented shallots, and a blend of spices no one's fully identified to this day. She called it Charitas Cauterium, which loosely translates to the healing burn of love. Mainstream convent records never mention it. Too spicy, too secular, too gleefully bold. But the underground spread was real. A few tiny jars were passed in secret between cloisters. Some sisters hid them in hollowed-out loaves of bread. One jar was sewn into the lining of a traveling sister's cloak and accidentally discovered when she leaned too close to a fire and released what witnesses described as a holy sting. The quirky twist. Every batch came with a note, a single handwritten line of scripture or proverb, rewritten to sound vaguely spicy. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the mild batch. The Lord will spew the lukewarm from his mouth. Forgive, but do not forget the flavor. Eventually, Sister Aldegundis was confronted. The abbess, suspicious of the sudden spike in water consumption during meals, demanded to see her storage cellar. But Aldegundis was clever. She'd hidden the relish behind jars labeled boiled parsnip extract, penitential use only. No one dared open those. So instead of a punishment, she was unofficially granted a sort of détente. She could make one batch a year distributed to the infirmary as invigorating tonic. Everyone winked and coughed politely. Historians still argue whether the relish's popularity came from its flavor or its myth. A few even speculate that it was the Abbey's secret export for several decades, cleverly traded under the vague name warming condiment Num 7. You sit now on a low bench as Sister Juliana retrieves a tiny jar from beneath a floorboard, a modern recreation, she explains, based on scraps of Aldegundis notes, old-tasting comments, and one very stained napkin. She unscrews the lid and lets you sniff. It smells like defiance and cloves, and just like that, a single spoonful of heat reminds you even the quietest lives need a little kick. Even in silence, there's room for flavor. The jar is passed around the circle. Sisters smile. One whispers, "Too much," and takes another bite anyway. The sun sinks lower. Laughter echoes softly. And somewhere behind a shelf of dusty crocks, a single label reads holy but dangerous. Handle with reverence. The sky outside glows the deep blue of approaching night. Lanterns are lit one by one. A breeze stirs the ivy on the walls, carrying with it the scent of cooling herbs, beeswax, and something saltier, something buried. You follow the sisters into the oldest part of the convent, past the cloister walk, and down a narrow stair carved into the hill itself. The air turns damp, the stone colder. At the bottom, behind a rusted latch and a prayer scrawled in chalk, lies a sealed chamber few speak of except in hushed tones. This is where they remember the last brining. You can feel it in your chest, even before the door creaks open, a story heavy with thyme and vinegar. It happened during one of the many regional conflicts that brushed past the abbey over the centuries. No invading army ever directly attacked the nuns. They had no weapons, no riches, nothing but jars and prayers. But when rumors began that raiders were pillaging storehouses for salt and food, the abbess made a decision. They would protect what mattered most. Not the silver chalice, not the manuscript with gold-illuminated saints. No, they would save the pickles, jars that had been fermenting for months, years. In some cases, precious batches of preserved cauliflower with lemon balm, rare figs with rosemary brine. Even the last of Sister Agnella's blessed cucumbers were wrapped in linen, packed in straw, and solemnly buried beneath the stone cellar, not for preservation, for hiding. Mainstream historians mention this event only briefly, usually in footnotes, about local disruptions in trade or weather. But the Abbey's internal chronicle devotes an entire chapter to it, titled simply, "In which we did not panic, but dug with purpose." The quirky detail. During the burial, the sisters held a liturgy. They processed around the jars, singing Ubi Caritas with solemn harmony, and read aloud the labels one by one, like a roll call of saints. Batch of Hope, onions 3 years aged. Sister Aldegunda's last fire brine, carrots of consolation for difficult winters. They cried quietly. A few even kissed the jar lids. One sister reportedly tried to sneak in a jar of gooseberry chutney, but was politely escorted back to her cell for overenthusiasm. Historians still argue whether the burial was symbolic or strategic. One theory suggests the sisters expected to return and unearth the jars once the danger had passed. Another insists it was a form of monastic resistance, preserving the soul of the abbey even if the buildings fell. As it turned out, the raiders never came, but the jars stayed buried for years, for decades. You kneel now in the cool chamber as the current sisters gently lift a flat stone and reveal a single surviving crop, its lid sealed with wax, its sides stained by earth and time. They don't open it. They never have. It rests in silence, surrounded by candles, and a single sprig of dill replaced every year on the feast of Saint Benedict. The label is still legible. Peace brine. Do not disturb unless joyfully necessary. And just like that, the cellar isn't just a basement. It's a shrine, a testament to quiet defiance, to care, to the idea that something small and sour, if treated with love, can outlast fear. The sisters stand quietly. One sings a single line, "What is salted shall not fade." You believe her. It's your last night in the abbey. The sky outside is inky and soft, the stars just visible beyond the leaded glass windows. The corridors are empty now. Every sister has retired to her cell. Her work finished, her jars sealed her brine, cooling on a shelf like a lullaby in liquid form. But you can't sleep, not just yet. Something calls you back to the chapel. It's quiet there, always is. Stone walls wrapped in shadow. The faint scent of beeswax and lavender still clings to the air. A single candle burns near the altar, flickering just enough to light the far side of the room where an old wooden bench waits. You sit, and from the darkness comes a sound, soft, familiar. Crunch. Someone's here. You turn your head slowly, and there she is, Sister Eulalia, 93 years old, mostly deaf, mostly retired, and still absolutely devoted to her midnight ritual. She doesn't notice you at first. She's focused on her task, extracting a single spear of cucumber from a small, unassuming jar and placing it gently, reverently on a wooden plate. Then, with the calmness of someone who's done this exact thing every night for 60 years, she lifts it to her lips and takes a bite. Crunch. Silence. She closes her eyes like she's hearing a psalm. This is a quiet crunch at Matins, an unofficial tradition, never recorded, never sanctioned, passed from elder to novice in whispered bedtime jokes and long glances over supper. The idea is simple. Each night, one sister honors all that's been preserved, not just the vegetables, but the memories, the effort, the flavor of stillness. One jar, one bite, one prayer. You don't disturb her. You just watch, tucked into your shadow, as she finishes, reseals the jar with care, and murmurs something to herself. You think you catch the words still crisp after all this time. The quirky detail. That jar isn't labeled. No tag, no wax seal, no date. No one remembers when it was first filled. Some say it belonged to Sister Adeltrudis. Others claim it's a myth that the jar refills itself, that the cucumbers grow softer, for some sharper for others, depending on what the soul needs. Historians wouldn't know what to do with that. You stay for a long time long after Sister Eulalia has shuffled off to bed, the chapel silent again. The jar remains waiting, the candle burns low. You walk back to your cell slowly, your footsteps the only sound. A jar sits by your bedside, a gift. Inside slices of beet fennel, and something you can't quite identify. The label says only safe to sleep now. You lie down, let the silence wrap around you like cool linen. The brine hums faintly in your memory. The abbey breathes. And just like that, the story ends not with a clang, but with a crunch. Let your eyes drift closed now, as the last of the candlelight flickers out, and the stone walls grow dim. Feel the stillness settle heavy in the best way, like a wool blanket, just warm enough, just weighted enough to remind you that you're here, safe, sheltered, in a place where time moves slowly, like vinegar soaking into the skin of something humble, transforming it into something sacred. Breathe in and let the scent of dill and garlic and clove drift into the corners of your thoughts. Imagine the jars all lined up, sealed with care, resting quietly on their shelves. They aren't in a rush. They know that good things take time. So do you. There's no hurry now. Every sister has gone to bed. The last candle has been pinched out. The wind outside whispers through ivy, like fingers through old pages. Nothing stirs, not even the old wooden spoon on the prayer shelf. Everything is still, and that stillness welcomes you. You don't need to understand every story. You don't need to remember every jar. Just let the echo of laughter, the scent of herbs, and the soft crunch of Sister Eulalia's midnight devotion lull you deeper, further down into the cool earth of rest. You are part of this place now, and here, everything that's been brined, kept, and quietly cared for is never truly forgotten. Sleep comes like closing a lid, gentle, secure. And tomorrow, well, there will always be more pickles.